All right. Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural Houston Institute lecture on the question, can philosophy help us live well? My name is James Prather. I'm the assistant director here. I also write and teach poetry as a part of the Institute. The Houston Institute, for those that are unfamiliar, is an independent academic nonprofit aimed at helping students, this includes undergraduate, graduate, medical, as well as faculty, think deeply about the best way to live. We do this through reading groups, through our own philosophical and literary writing, and through bigger kind of public readings, debates, and lectures each night, like this is. Those are broad descriptions, so let me give you a brief glimpse at what it looks like on a weekly basis. So especially with our work with students, we have a Tuesday night philosophy reading group. We'll do a Wednesday lunch literature reading group, and then you can scatter some mentorship meetings throughout. Beyond our work with Rice and Medical Center students, we host monthly salons for adults during the school year. These are basically reading groups for adults, because the adults like to have fun as well, that type of thing. Last academic year, to give you a sense of numbers, in total, we ran more than 70 student events with around 130 unique students attending those events. The heart of our work, though, I would say, is pursuing in close detail questions, especially the big questions that kind of frame our everyday existence. We just concluded a reading group on the question, can war be just? Our Love and War literature reading group, which I lead, has been asking for the past 2 semesters, why does romantic love sometimes turn into hate? Into a war between lovers, which is kind of the classic up and down the ages. Yeah. Easy. Your wife is right next to you, so calm down. We have thinkers like Aristotle and poets like Virgil at our core, but our investigations often span across today's political boundaries and even across history, from Aquinas to Nietzsche, from Sappho to Seamus Heaney. Tonight, of course, the title of our lecture may seem obvious for some. For most of the crowd, y'all came, so you probably like philosophy, so you're probably saying, yes, philosophy can help us live well. I have a feeling as to what Professor McPherson is going to say. But I would like to emphasize that, especially in the frenetic pace of a life in Houston, Texas in 2025, we often forego the depth that is implied by this yes to philosophy and what it means both to do philosophy and to live well. Answering foundational questions like these has a habit of assuring us of our footing as we are more and more compelled by what is beautiful towards what is true. Okay, I'll stop waxing metaphysical for y'all. I'll let Victor Sines, our executive director, introduce tonight's speaker. Thank y'all for coming.
All right. Let's see here. Is this thing on?
There we go. Well, good. Well, welcome everyone. Delighted to see so many people. I think this room is pretty good for voice projection. Yes, people can hear me. Good. So, as James mentioned, I'm Dr. Victor Sines. I'm executive director here at Houston Institute. Before I introduce our speaker, Professor David McPherson, let me tell you a little bit about our schedule tonight. So Professor McPherson would talk for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Then we'll begin to wrap things up at around 8:55. And after the fact, we'll have a little reception right out here. So if you're eager to talk to our speaker tonight, we encourage you to come to our reception. It'll be my job to make sure he gets over there, because otherwise people never get to the food. So if you're wondering what we're doing with the speaker, that's what we're doing. So we hope that many of you will stay to continue the conversation tonight. So let me just say a little bit about our speaker tonight. So David McPherson is professor of philosophy at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education, and he's also affiliate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Florida. By the way, so he had a little bit of a trek to get here. So We had like 3 delays or something like this. So he really worked hard to be here. So I'm grateful he's here. So
I was up
and
at
I think you will
this
too.
morning.
It's very early flight this morning. So he came all the way from Florida. So previously he was an associate professor of philosophy at Creighton University, and during the academic year 2021 to 2022, he was visiting research professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. He works especially in the areas of ethics, especially virtue ethics, political philosophy, meaning of life, and philosophy of religion. He is author of the book The Virtues of Limits with Oxford University Press 2022, Virtue and Meaning, a Neo-Aristotelian Perspective. This is Cambridge University Press 2020. And I should say about this book, Virtue and Meaning, here's what one reviewer had to say about the book. This reviewer writes, "This book is strikingly excellent."
It's nice.
It is. It goes on. It goes on. This book is strikingly excellent. It is beautifully argued.
I wrote notes.
Fair-minded, and a pleasure to read. I would not be surprised if people someday spoke of it alongside the works of Elizabeth Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and a few others. By the way, if you're in the philosophy world,
A bit excessive, yeah.
these are big names, right? So these are really big names. So all this to say, so it's a real privilege to be here with Dr. McPherson. So he's also editor of Spirituality and the Good Life, Philosophical Approaches with Cambridge University Press. And he has also published numerous articles and book chapters. And he's currently working on a Templeton project, 3-year Templeton University of Florida funding grant project on spiritual yearning and the problem of spiritual alienation, which will result in his 3rd book as well as an edited book. So he keeps busy, in other words. So alienation, anxiety, I think these are the kinds of things that we're going to be hearing about tonight. So please help me to welcome Professor David McPherson.
Well, thanks so much, Victor, for that very nice introduction and for inviting me to come here. And I'm really honored to be here, the first inaugural lecture of the Houston Institute. I'm very honored all of you came out on a Tuesday night to hear me talk about philosophy and why I think it's important for living well. So I do have a PowerPoint. It's sort of an aid to, so I have my talk written out here, but the PowerPoint is sort of an aid to follow along. Just so some will be quotations, some will just be bits from the text. I tend to maybe overdo it on the amount of text on the screen, so I'm not a PowerPoint expert, but anyways, I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. I'm very grateful to the Houston Institute for having me on, and of course, all of you for coming here. So, can philosophy help us live well? So that's the question of our lecture for today. Do you want to know who these guys are? Anyone know? Aristotle, Plato, right? And their philosophies are, I won't get all into the details of their philosophy expressed, but if you go to the Vatican, you can see that painting. I remember walking around the corner, and there it was. It was like an epiphany. Okay, so can philosophy help us to live well? I want to argue that it can, and in taking this position, this doesn't sound like too controversial, because I find myself in good company. Socrates thought that philosophy is important for what he called care of the soul, and he went so far as to say famously that the unexamined life is not worth living. Likewise, Plato and Aristotle argued that a philosophical or contemplative life is the best kind of life. Now, of course, a philosopher is going to say the philosophical life is the best kind of life. Part of what I'm going to argue is that we're all philosophers. So it's not merely just an academic enterprise. I'll come back to that. But in general, ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, along with some medieval philosophers, regarded philosophy as a way of life. So this wider kind of conception of philosophy, I think, is a way of life. Specifically, it's a wisdom-seeking way of life. So I have there philosophy, a wisdom-seeking way of life. Since philosophy, as many of you perhaps know, comes from the Greek word meaning love of wisdom or the ardent pursuit of wisdom, where the wisdom sought is only fully realized in a life well lived. So there's going to be a connection between this wisdom that is sought and a life well lived. So it's in the name itself, right? So is philosophy going to live up to its name? Well, in fact, if we look at modern and contemporary philosophy, I think among modern and contemporary philosophers, there's more skepticism about philosophy's capacity to help us to live well. Indeed, many academic philosophers have abandoned the traditional wisdom-seeking conception of philosophy. For instance, it's common to divide philosophy between analytic approaches, are sort of more common in the Anglo-American sphere, and what are called continental approaches. So many analytic philosophers see philosophy's primary role as being that of conceptual analysis, and in many cases seek to emulate the methods of the natural sciences. So one philosopher, Bernard Williams, he wrote an essay called Philosophy as a Humanistic Discipline. He said there's many philosophers who think if they fuss around with enough counterexamples that they're conducting the equivalent of a biochemical protocol. But philosophy, he suggests, should not be seen as a science in that sort of way. Maybe it helps the sciences in some ways, but it's not exactly a science. However, while many continental philosophers often trade in deep-sounding but obscure utterances that fail to bring clarity to our lives. So some of you may be familiar with people like Jacques Derrida, some kind of postmodern thinkers. Maybe they have some virtues, but they'll make your head hurt trying to read them and understand what they're saying. So I, at least, I'll just speak for myself, don't find too much clarity brought to my life in that. And what I think is lost is this humanistic vision of philosophy. As I've sort of suggested already, I want to argue that philosophy is a fundamentally important human endeavor. So I've already forgot to start clicking on this thing. So I want to argue that philosophy is a fundamentally important human endeavor and not merely just an academic enterprise. And when properly pursued as a wisdom-seeking endeavor, I think it can be regarded as a humanizing endeavor, right? That it helps us to live well as human beings. So I want to make the case that philosophy is deeply connected to our humanity. And it's an important part of being human. I will begin by discussing how philosophy begins from an experience of alienation from the world. So Victor already cued in that this theme of alienation is going to crop up. I think philosophy is connected with a certain experience of alienation. And in fact, it can further contribute to that experience of alienation through putting our life-orienting beliefs into question, right? So there can be something unsettling about philosophizing, right? That we put some of our cherished beliefs into question, those things that help us to make sense of our lives. And so in some cases there can be resistance to philosophy, to not want to engage in the examined life because it can be unsettling or it can be alienating, as in sort of the terms like bewildering is a term I'll come back to later. And so I think philosophy requires kind of an openness, but also conviction, trying to balance these two things, that we're seeking something, right? But we're not guaranteed the outcome, right, in advance, right? And so there's some way of like setting out into the unknown. However, I want to argue that ultimately philosophy should seek to offer therapy for such alienation through seeking wisdom, where wisdom is understood as a kind of holistic understanding that provides us with a meaningful life orientation. I will further argue that this wisdom-seeking endeavor of philosophy should be understood to involve not only rational examination of our beliefs, our lives, and the world around us through critical reflection and discursive argument, but also appreciative attention to what is of value in the world. So I think this is something that's often lost in conceptions of philosophy. I think we mostly think of philosophy as just argument, critical reflection, discursive reasoning, but we miss the part that has to do with appreciative attention. But if any of you are familiar with the Greek term, we'll come back to this Greek term for contemplation. People think contemplation and philosophy, those are the same thing, and I think they are, but contemplation, one of its two senses, is that it's simply appreciative attention. The term theoria, which we also get theater, the idea of a spectacle, it has the sense of looking, beholding, or what I'm calling appreciative attention. So these are two aspects of wisdom seeking, which are part of the two senses of contemplation. One being the examined life, and the second being appreciative attention. Right? So I think if there's something that maybe sounds a little unusual, people don't typically think of that second part, but I want to make the case that that's also part of philosophy, insofar as philosophy is a wisdom-seeking endeavor, right? It has to involve practices of appreciative attention to value, right? So we'll come back to that. Okay, so I want to begin with this theme of philosophy and alienation. So as I said, philosophy begins from an experience of alienation. In fact, I would call it a kind of spiritual alienation. I'm using spiritual in a very broad sense that has to do with a kind of space, you might call it the space of meaning, of sort of meaning seeking. Meaning, spirituality is a sort of broad sense of a search for some self-transcending source of meaning that enables a kind of practical life orientation for ourselves, right? So in my current book project, which Victor mentioned, Spiritual Alienation, The Quest for God, I define spiritual alienation as the state of being estranged from the place of fullness or the sense of meaning in life. As Charles Taylor puts it, we all see our lives and or the space wherein we live our lives as having a certain moral, spiritual shape. Somewhere in some activity or condition lies a fullness. In that place or activity, life is fuller, richer, deeper, more worthwhile, more admirable, more what it should be. So we all have this sense of like that place we're trying to get to, where we're, as it were, really living, right? Getting to that point, right? And I think this is one way of thinking about a life well lived. We're trying to live a full life, a fulfilled life, right? So living well, we can talk about in terms of the fulfilled life or experience, an experience of fullness. I argue that, that spiritual alienation, understood as a separation from this place of fullness, is the fundamental problem to which the spiritual life seeks to respond. And I illustrate this with a philosophical reflection on the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, which I argue can be read as a story about spiritual alienation being a perennial feature of the human condition, where it goes along with our emergence into rational, ethical, and spiritual self-consciousness. Building on this reflection, I argue that there are three main perennial forms of spiritual alienation, which are connected to our human form of rational, ethical, and spiritual self-consciousness, and which can be understood as part of what it means to be separated from the place of fullness. So the first is self-alienation. So by self-alienation, I mean our lack of integration with the good. It's that experience of being divided. If any of you have read Augustine's Confessions, this is his idea of the divided will. One part wants to serve God, one part wants to live sort of the life, the debauching life that he was living up to that point, and sort of the honor seeking that he was also engaged in. But if some of you are familiar with Aristotle, he has this idea of akrasia, sometimes translated as a weakness of the will or lack of self-control. This idea of why don't we do the things we think we should do, right? We know what the right thing to do is, but we don't do it. It's an experience of sort of being divided against ourselves. So I think this is a key issue. I'm calling it broadly the spiritual life. Obviously, this sounds more like the ethical, moral life, but I don't actually want to make a strong distinction between these realms, because I think we should also include the aesthetic realm, the experience of beauty, seeking truth, all these things. I think we need some term that can encompass these different pursuits. That self-alienation is often also linked with the experience of alienation from others. So when we're not aligned with the good, we engage in wrongdoing that causes alienation from others. And so that can cause inability to be united to people in friendship. Aristotle thinks the best kind of friendship involves people pursuing the good together. But if you're not pursuing the good, you can't be united in that deepest kind of friendship. And so it can lead to a kind of loneliness. One philosopher, Eleanor Stump, calls it will loneliness, that we will our own loneliness by failing to will the good, right? Or willing what's not the good, right? I think there's also a lot of unwilled loneliness as well, right? It's a part of our, if you look at that biblical story, the Garden of Eden, it's really, loneliness plays a key role. God, the beginning of what we might call the humanizing process is when God says, it's not good that the man should be alone. Adam is alone but not lonely until he starts naming the animals. It's the first instance of human speech. He starts distinguishing himself from the other animals and experiences loneliness for the first time. You see that expressed when God makes Eve. He says, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Part of my reading of this story is that we all begin, as it were, in a Garden of Eden, a state of innocence and simplicity, but as we emerge into rational, moral, spiritual self-consciousness, we also experience alienation in each of these domains. We experience being divided against ourselves. We experience this alienation from others, loneliness, but also wrongdoing. We feel guilt and shame, and we need to make amends, or maybe wrong's been done against us, and we need forgiveness, right? We need to give forgiveness, or, you know, there's sort of two sides of the alienation there. And the last is what I want to call alienation from the world, right? And so this one is maybe a little trickier. The first two may seem sort of straightforward, but it's particularly this last one where I think philosophy is connected to it. It sort of arises out of, or it's connected to this experience of alienation from the world. So alienation from the world, I say, arises from our nature as philosophical, meaning-seeking animals. We're unlike non-rational animals who are at home in their environment. We are tasked with finding our place in the world. That is, with discovering a meaningful life orientation toward the good. So it's part of what's distinctive of our humanity that we can actually experience alienation from the world. And this, I think, is a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing because we can come to understand and appreciate the world and our place within it, and thereby determine how best to live. But it is also a curse because we can worry about our lives in a way that non-rational animals do not. Right? So that's why I say it's a blessing and a curse. And we see this actually in Kant. Kant gives there's sort of a tradition of philosophical readings of the Garden of Eden story. It's a very sort of powerful story within the Western tradition. A number of Western philosophers reflect on it. Hegel did as well. Of course, Augustine did. Kierkegaard and many others. But Kant, in his reflections, here's a quotation that I think gets at one important aspect of the sense in which we can speak of a blessing and a curse. He says, the outcome of that first experiment whereby man became conscious of his reason as a faculty which can extend beyond the limits to which all animals are confined was of great importance and influences his way of life decisively. So we can sort of step back from our environment, as it were, and reflect on it. He discovered in himself an ability to choose his own way of life without being tied to any single one like other animals. But the momentary gratification which this realization of his superiority may have afforded him was inevitably followed at once by anxiety and fear as to how he should employ his newly discovered ability. He stood, as it were, on the edge of an abyss. I think that's a very powerful line. He stood, as it were, on the edge of an abyss. So our coming into rational self-consciousness brings before us, in many ways, an anxiety-inducing kind of question of, like, how should I live my life, right? How ought I to live? And we have to figure that out. Kant's reflections here anticipate Martin Heidegger's later reflections on the experience of anxiety or angst over making life-defining choices, which involve a feeling of not at homeness. He uses this German word unheimlich, which is like unhomelike. Feeling is a nice German word. Not feeling at home in the world, right? That we sort of are disoriented. It's this experience of disorientation. We begin to question things, right? And we're trying, it's up to us to make a determination of how we should live, right? It's a profoundly personal question. It's important to see that our coming into rational self-consciousness not only makes possible our choosing a way of life, but also, relatedly, a way of questioning the world and our place within it. Within the course of our lives, we are confronted by experiences that are puzzling or disconcerting. We might think of just the problem of evil and suffering, for instance, a kind of classic problem, right? Or we might, start wondering, why is there anything at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? Think of these sort of grand traditional philosophical questions. And so we begin puzzling or we're disconcerted, trying to figure things out, such that we are forced to step back from our engaged modes of experience and reflect on our lives and the world around us, and thereby try to make sense of our lives. Okay, so this is Rembrandt painting of Aristotle looking at Homer. Okay, that's what that is. So I'm going to quote some Aristotle now. So as Aristotle famously remarks at the beginning of the Metaphysics, let me get to our quote here. It is because of wonder that human beings undertake philosophy both now and its origins. And that's actually, at least by philosophy terms, a pretty famous quotation. And that sounds really nice. Oh, it's because of wonder, right? We tend to think of wonder as this very positive, sort of euphoric experience. And that's certainly one sense of wonder, right? But another sense of wonder is being deeply perturbed or feeling bewilderment. And in fact, it's more that sense that Aristotle means, because he goes on to say, we philosophize in order to no longer feel at a loss in the world, right? So So this is more of a sense of, I say, deep puzzlement or bewilderment at things. And here, you think of that term bewilder, right? It's to cause one to lose one's way in a metaphorical wilderness. It's like Dante at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, having, midway upon life's journey, having found yourself lost in a dark woods, right? It's like the midlife crisis is one way in which people might begin to philosophize. And I often say to my students in my class when I'm teaching philosophy, I say, part of the goal of this class is to help you have your midlife crisis early, so you don't have to go buy the damn Lamborghini. They're cool, but it's not going to help you solve your problems. Not that I actually want them to have that crisis, but I want them to address the kinds of questions from which those sorts of crises arise. What's my life about? What's my place in the world? Does my life make a difference? Can suffering be redeemed? And all those sorts of questions that I think have been part of philosophy since the beginning. So we have this experience of bewilderment, and philosophy begins from an experience of bewilderment or alienation. There's another way of talking about this sort of feeling of alienation or not at homeness. Further, as I already suggested, philosophy can further contribute to this experience of alienation as we voluntarily step back from our engaged modes of experience where we are in the flow, so to speak, and put things into question, including our most cherished beliefs that help to orient ourselves in the world. But again, I think this should not be the ending point. This is what spurs that ardent pursuit of wisdom. The love of wisdom arises out of this experience of alienation. You're wanting to make sense of things. You're wanting to discover wisdom, a kind of holistic understanding that orients you in the world, right? Okay, so where am I at in my slides here? All right, I think I've said all that. All right. So I'll get back to this fellow. This is David Hume. So again, to seek wisdom, we must engage in the examined life, which includes examining the world. Maybe I'll go back so we have that whole slide on alienation. So to seek wisdom, we must engage in the examined life, which includes examining the world and our place within it. Seeking wisdom means seeking a kind of holistic understanding that enables us to be at home in the world through providing us with a meaningful life orientation, particularly towards some conception of the good or what it is to live well as a human being. As David Cooper puts it, this is a matter of finding a measure for our lives to which we are answerable, finding something beyond ourselves to which we are answerable. He writes, philosophy's enterprise is a dual one of a search for a sense of integration within the way of things and a quest to find within that way of things a measure for our lives. Otherwise put, is the endeavor to overcome alienation and to become, as he says, liberated from the horrible thought that our lives are answerable to nothing beyond themselves. Maybe you don't share his sense of horror at that. I think many people have wanted their lives to be some sense of a good to which they need to be responsive, or maybe some sense of the beautiful or truth, right? See their life as serving something beyond themselves to which they're answerable. Philosophy is so understood as a profoundly human endeavor rather than a merely academic enterprise, and when properly pursued, it can be a humanizing endeavor, realizing an integral, important feature of our humanity. However, as I've already mentioned, there are a number of modern and contemporary philosophers who reject this grand traditional vision of philosophy as a wisdom-seeking endeavor to find a measure for our lives within the way of things, and thereby to become at home in the world. This grand traditional vision of philosophy is rejected either because of a skepticism regarding our ability to attain such wisdom, or because one simply believes there is none to be found. Okay, so this is where we're going to turn to Hume, to what I'm calling philosophical quietism. So consider David Hume in a famous passage, which I will get up here, near the end of book 1 of his treatise of human nature, which he wrote when he was like 23, or he published when he was 23, which is insane. But they didn't have to, he had very few footnotes. So at that time, it's like not that, he's like lifting passages. But it's still impressive. It's still very impressive. This is like a big book that says monumental significance in the history of modern philosophy. So at the end of book 1 of Treatise on Human Nature, Hume remarks when he's faced with certain ultimate questions regarding human existence, such as, this is Hume, from what causes do I derive my existence? To what condition shall I return? Whose favor shall I court? Whose anger must I dread? He's clearly sort of referencing the possible belief in God here. Hume was a skeptic on that front. What beings surround me? On whom may I have any influence, and who have influence on me? And having found himself confounded by all these questions, he attempts to cure himself, as he puts it in a wonderful phrase, his philosophical melancholy and delirium. There's a great book on Hume called Philosophical Melancholy and Delirium, Hume on the Pathologies of Philosophy, a philosopher David Livingstone. It's a great book. I recommend it. Not that I agree with all aspects of it, but it's a very interesting book. So to cure himself of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, he resorts to various forms of diversion, clearly taking a shot at Pascal. Pascal is famous for saying, our besetting condition is our inability to sit quietly in a room and not sort of be diverted all the time. But Hume here is recommending diversion. So he says, okay, he's got this philosophical melancholy and delirium, and he writes, I dine, I play a game of backgammon, not played so much as a game back in the 18th century. I converse and I marry with my friends, and when after 3 or 4 hours amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold, strained, and ridiculous that I cannot find it in my heart to enter into any further. Here then I find myself absolutely and necessarily determined to live and talk and act like other people in the common affairs of life. So the philosopher's kind of a pathological weirdo on this view. Right? You just got to go hang out with your chums, kind of get over it, and you'll be fine, right? Okay, so that's, philosophy's just going to mess you up, right? And there's, I don't know, there's a few philosophy majors here. I don't know, what's your view on that? Maybe it messes some people up. That's certainly a distinct possibility, but the traditional vision holds out hope that it can actually help us to live well. At least that's the vision I'm going to try to be putting forward here. In any case, in this passage, we can observe Hume's distaste for metaphysical hypotheses and speculations that go beyond what he regards as the limits of human understanding. He insists that philosophy should instead remain faithful to the common experiences of everyday life. Quote, be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man, right? So don't, or be still a human being. Don't let your philosophy dehumanize you. And I would agree with that. I would agree. Be a philosopher, but be still a human being. But I think philosophy is a key part of our humanity. And so it's not something that we can simply escape from without detriment. But in any case, Hume seems to suggest here that real life exists outside of philosophy in common life. And insofar as philosophy maintains a role, it is nothing, as he puts it, but the reflections of common life, methodized and corrected. So that's sort of Hume's vision of philosophy. So here we see a kind of what I'm calling a philosophical quietism that seeks to remain content with not having answers to ultimate questions of human existence, such as whether there is a measure for our lives within the way of things, and adopts instead a diffusing strategy. Let's see, do I have this? Okay. So this is another philosophical quietism, Wittgenstein. You may have heard of Ludwig Wittgenstein. So again, this philosophical quietism seeks to remain content with not having these answers to ultimate questions, and adopts what I'm calling a diffusing strategy that maintains we do not need to address these ultimate questions in any case. What matters is that we have meaningful or sufficiently enjoyable experiences within common life. Maybe not even within common life. Maybe you just, like doing, like watching TV all day and or whatever, surfing the web, arguing with people on, Twitter or whatever. Maybe that's enough for you. You don't need to philosophize. We can see something similar, I think, in Wittgenstein in his idea of sort of immersion within particular forms of life, right? We don't need to philosophize as long as we have sufficiently meaningful experiences within some particular form of life. That's enough. Within these quietist approaches, there is a typically attempt to either get beyond philosophy altogether, to show the fly out of the fly bottle, as Wittgenstein put it, or else to give philosophy a more tempered role in exploring our human world and its meanings. We saw something of that in Hume. Interestingly, neither of them stopped doing philosophy. That's sort of indicative, I think, of my point. We see a recent example of this latter approach of a more tempered role for philosophy in John Keats's essay, The Human World, which seeks to chart a path between a pessimistic naturalist worldview on the one hand, which despairs of our inability to find a measure for our lives within the way of things, and a religious worldview where there's a God-given measure within the way of things, but which Keats at least regards as an unsubstantial dream. And you could contest that, but we'll sort of leave that aside for the time being. Regarding pessimistic naturalism, he notes that there's a worry that our caring is ultimately senseless, the things we care about. And the reason often given is that from the point of the view of the universe, what one philosopher, Thomas Nagel, called the view from nowhere, nothing matters, sort of the overall grand scheme of things, right? Independent of any particular perspective, nothing matters. To this, Keeks responds, of course, we need not view things, what happens from that standpoint, subspecies aeternitatis, from the standpoint of eternity or the overall view of things. We can view it from our point of view, subspecies humanitatis. Things matter because they affect our well-being. The world does not care, but we care. Right? So as long as we care about things, that's enough. Right? We don't need to worry about sort of our place in the world. Since we care about how things affect our well-being, he thinks we should seek to take control of our lives as far as possible in order to enhance human well-being while acknowledging the limits of our control. What we should avoid is the attempt to find a measure for our lives outside of the human world. Keeks thinks that the impulse to go beyond the human world and explore what lies outside of it is probably irresistible, as he puts it, and he sees this in both religious and scientific inquiry, but we could also add philosophical inquiry. Keeks is not suggesting that we do away with this impulse completely, as seems impossible, but he does not want it to replace, as he puts it, our human concerns, which will be a denial of our humanity in his view. So again, this is sort of the be a philosopher but be still a man kind of view of Hume. He writes, I share Montaigne's sentiment that these transcendental humors frighten me. They lead to trying to escape from humanity, and this is madness. We seek other conditions because we do not understand our own. That's, again, Keeks sort of appealing to Montaigne. Another way to express Keeks' concern is in terms of alienation. He is worried about the ways in which our intellectual and spiritual life can lead to estrangement from our human condition. And this is a valid worry that I think we should contend with. The problem with Keeks' argument here, which also applies to other philosophical quietists, is that these transcendental humors, as he's calling them, are in fact part of our humanity. The attempt to seek to understand what's beyond maybe the immediate grasp of our experience or our understanding, right? That sort of transcendental urge, so to speak, to seek something beyond is part of our humanity rather than opposed to it. So again, it's an expression of our human concerns rather than a threat to replace them. In particular, it's connected with our emergence of the rational and philosophical self-consciousness and our desire to find a way to be at home in the world through the pursuit of wisdom or holistic understanding. Quietist approaches, So these quietist, this is sort of the third part there. Quietist approaches that seek to get beyond philosophy altogether, or else give it a more tempered role in exploring our human world while rejecting the importance of a cosmic outlook for our human form of life, can be understood as attempts to get back to a primal state of innocence, back to something like the Garden of Eden before our philosophical fall. So if we want to kind of extend that sort of Garden of Eden metaphor, there's sort of this sense that there's a philosophical fall, this philosophical melancholy and delirium, and to try to get beyond philosophy, to try to get back to this state of innocence and simplicity. But we cannot, in fact, in turn, since the desire to understand the world and our place within it is integral to our humanity. We might say, in fact, it would be a dehumanizing move, right? If part of our humanity is connected with our coming into rational, ethical, spiritual self-consciousness, the attempt to get back to a state of innocence prior to that would, in fact, be a dehumanizing move. Now, when Socrates said that the unexamined life was not worth living, I believe he overstated the matter. So I'm saying philosophy is connected to our humanity, but I want to push back a little bit on Socrates here. When he said the unexamined life is not worth living, that's overstating, at least if by unexamined life he means a life without much examination. Surely one can live a worthwhile life without much examination of his or her life. For example, by being a good friend, spouse, parent, living a morally decent life, engaging in, say, practices of religious devotion or productive, worthwhile work, and so forth. But I also think there's something important missing in a life without some significant place given for contemplation. What Socrates should have said, I think, and I worry to correct Socrates here, especially on such a famous statement, the unexamined life is not worth living. But if you've ever read Plato's dialogue, Socrates is kind of annoying, right? He's, by definition, he's the gadfly, right? He's out, he got killed for his way of doing philosophy, which that may be what it has to come to. But anyways, he was kind of annoying. He pestered people. So, anyways, saying the unexamined life is not worth living is a little bit finger wagging. But I think that we could say maybe in a lesser, maybe like kind of take it down a notch and say there would be something, regrettable a life that didn't have some significant place for reflection in it, because it's part of being human. It's part of why we think it's good to have a university education and to read books and think and all these sort of things. In some sense, it's a shame to not give some place for that in human life. Of course, some people aren't afforded the privilege of that kind of space, and so that can be something, again, we could regret. We might think we should try to make the conditions where there's more space for leisure. And I'm going to come back to the theme of leisure, but leisure is an important part, the ancient philosophers thought, of a good human life. However, I want to say it's questionable that any normal functioning adult human being lives a completely unexamined life. The picture is you got to be like an academic philosopher or your life is not worth living. I think that's pretty bogus. But I think all human beings engage in some level of philosophical reflection, right? All mature human beings at least live some answer to many of the grand traditional philosophical questions, such as how ought I to live? Is there a meaning to human life? What is the ultimate nature of reality? Is there a God? Why is the world out of joint? Can suffering be redeemed? How do I know what is true and how do I know it? Etc. Right? These are all sort of grand traditional philosophical questions. Okay. So I do actually have Socrates. I don't know if you can see, it's pretty faint in the background. That's well, he's taking the cup of hemlock after annoying everyone. All right. So Mary Midgley says we all live according to what she calls world pictures, perspectives, imaginative visions of how the whole world is. And she says the business of philosophy is something that concerns everybody, since it aims to bring together those aspects of life that have not yet been properly connected so as to make a more coherent, more workable world picture. In other words, the main task of philosophy, she says, is to examine our life as a whole, to make sense of it, to locate its central confusions, and to resolve its big conflicts. Philosophy is thus not merely one academic subject amongst others, but rather it is something we are all doing all the time, a continuous background activity which is likely to go badly if we don't attend to it. So this is the idea that we're all naturally philosophers. We all reflect on our lives to some degree. We're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to see how our world picture hangs together, to deal with its conflicts and confusions, and to make sense of things, right? Okay. Kind of to similar effect, G.K. Chesterton writes, philosophy is merely thought that has been thought out. We have no alternative except between being influenced by thought that has been thought out and being influenced by thought that has not been thought out. So this sort of characteristic Chestertonian wit here, right? He's got a nice way of putting it. So we have two options, right? And again, I'm suggesting that, we all think our thoughts out to some degree, right? Okay. The idea here, again, is that we all have some awareness of the answers we live to the ultimate questions of human existence. And to some extent, we reflect on such answers and try to make sure our world pictures are coherent and rationally defensible. The discipline of philosophy aims to extend this natural human reflection and make it more systematic. And in the process of articulating and rationally defending a particular vision of the world and our place within it, we can be led to more refined and enriched understanding. So I think this is ultimately the hope of philosophy, is that it allows you to have a more enriched understanding of the world, a kind of transfigured vision, so to speak. So I've suggested that the wisdom-seeking of philosophy is an important human endeavor, but I also want to suggest it can be understood as an important spiritual endeavor in line with Pierre Hadot's book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. Some of you may be familiar with this particular text. Through philosophy, so understood, we seek to orient our lives in the world, which is the opposite of being at a loss or in a state of existential vertigo, in light of a self-transcending source of meaning that we see as making demands on our lives. In other words, philosophy properly understood as an integrally important human endeavor should be regarded as a kind of spiritual exercise and part of a way of life, in line with the ancient conception of philosophy that has been discussed by Pierre Hadot. So here's a couple quotations from Hadot. So the first, he writes, the ancient philosophical school corresponds above all to the choice of a certain way of life and existential option, which demands from the individual a total change of lifestyle, a conversion of one's entire being, and ultimately a certain desire to be and live in a certain way. This existential option, in turn, implies a certain vision of the world. And the task of philosophical discourse would therefore be to reveal and rationally justify this existential option, as well as this representation of the world, right? So that, is that spirituality? Is that philosophy? It's both, right? Elsewhere, he writes, under normal circumstances, the only state accessible to human beings is philosophia, the love of and progress toward wisdom. For this reason, spiritual exercises must be taken up again and again in an ever-renewed effort. To the same extent that the philosophical life is equivalent to the practice of spiritual exercises, it is also a tearing away from everyday life. It is a conversion, a total transformation of one's vision, lifestyle, and behavior. Right? So that's a very encompassing view of philosophy. I'm not sure how much that's actually practiced in philosophy departments, although there is a growing number of philosophers who are sort of practicing a philosophy as a way of life pedagogy. And probably if we want to keep philosophy in the curriculum, not a bad idea. It sort of connects up with people's lives. So I think I'm an advocate of that approach to philosophy and to philosophical teaching. So in referring to philosophical life as equivalent to the practice of spiritual exercise, so that may be striking to people. It's equivalent to the practice of spiritual exercises. That's not how most people think of philosophy today, which you can think suggests that it's maybe not in the same wisdom-seeking tradition, perhaps, or maybe it's a limited aspect of that. And it's demanding this sort of philosophical life, demanding conversion of one's entire being. We are encouraged to see a close connection between the spiritual life and the philosophical life. If even you've read Plato's Republic, the allegory of the cave, right, there's a kind of turning towards the good, right? There's crucial turnings. Sees education as a kind of turning, or again, we might say a conversion of one's being to being oriented towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. So such a vision will be one by which we can overcome our alienation from the world through discovering our place within it. That is, through discovering a meaningful life orientation towards the good. Here we see that we need not only rational examination, but a certain mode of appreciative attention to the world. Right? So again, this is another thing that I think gets lost in our conception of philosophy. Philosophy is a wisdom-seeking endeavor, not only involves the examined life in the sense of rational argument, critical reflection, but it also needs to involve contemplation as appreciative attention. Okay, so that's Iris Murdoch. Maybe some of you know Iris Murdoch, either from her philosophy or from her novels, but she's very interested in the theme of attention or appreciative attention. So as I've said, there's these two senses of contemplation. One is the examined life, which we see with Socrates enjoining on us. The second is contemplation, and this is, again, as I suggested at the beginning, the primary sense of the Greek term for contemplation, theoria. Here, contemplation involves appreciative attention to, or a loving gaze or beholding of, something worthy of love and appreciation. So you might think of like going to the art museum, right, and you contemplate a painting, right? It's that sense of, you're like looking at it, you're appreciating it, right? And maybe you're reflecting, but sometimes you're just beholding its beauty, right? It's like if you have a newborn baby and you're like beholding it, right? And someone's like, what you trying to do with that baby? And you're saying, I'm just beholding it lovingly, right? Not trying to do anything, right? So this sense of contemplation is not trying to do anything. You're receptive to the value that's there. You're appreciatively attending to it, right? Okay. So Iris Murdoch, building on Simone Weil's work on attention, especially Simone Weil has this essay on prayer, the uses of prayer for schoolwork, and talks a lot about attention. So Murdoch wants to develop this in a more secular context about the importance. She wants to develop an account of the importance of attention for our moral lives. We might say for our spiritual lives. So she writes here, we can all receive moral help by focusing our attention upon things that are valuable, virtuous people, great art, the idea of goodness itself. She was a Platonist, just so you know. Our ability to act well when the time comes depends partly, perhaps largely, upon the quality of our habitual objects of attention. She gives the example. So let me back up here. For Murdoch, the chief moral help we receive from this appreciative attention is overcoming our selfishness and seeing reality as it is, including the reality of beauty and goodness. She especially emphasizes an appreciation for beauty in art or nature here, since she says, not only for all its difficulties is it the easiest available spiritual exercise, is also a completely adequate entry, or not just an analogy of the good life, since it is a checking of selfishness and an interest of seeing the real. So appreciation of beauty and art can connect us to reality. Murdoch gives the example of coming to observe a kestrel, which causes a change in her consciousness from a previous anxious and resentful state of mind to a self-forgetful, appreciative attention to the independent existence of another being. Although observing the kestrel in this case was a happenstance, she notes that this kind of appreciative attention is something that we can deliberately practice and cultivate as a habit. Indeed, it can be a kind of spiritual exercise. So again, thinking of philosophies involving spiritual exercises, chief amongst them is this kind of appreciative attention. Such talk of appreciative attention as a spiritual exercise is important not only for the moral life, but also for the spiritual life. It's suggestive of a practical life orientation towards a self-transcending source of meaning or value, which is how I think we can understand this concept of spirituality. But is appreciative attention to the independent existence of a bird or a great work of art or something similar by itself spiritually enough? So I want to connect to this sort of a broader question of how we relate to the world as a whole. And I want to talk about what I call the problem of cosmodicy. So this means, so the problem of cosmodicy is how do we justify and affirm life in the world as good and worthwhile in the face of evil and suffering. So some of you may have heard of the problem of theodicy. How do we justify God's ways in the face of evil and suffering? A theodicy is a defense of God, right? A cosmodicy is, in essence, a defense of the world, right? Is it good to be here? Is it good to have been born, right? That's a fundamental question of human existence. And philosophy is sort of wrapped up with that from the beginning. So I want to turn again to Aristotle. So in the Eudemian Ethics, and what I think is one of the most existentially resonant passages in all of Aristotle, he raises the question whether it's good to have been born rather than never to have been. And some of you who maybe know Sophocles, the tragic poet, in one of his works says, best of all would be never to have been, second best would be to die as quickly as possible, right? Very pessimistic, right? So this sort of question was around in sort of the Greek world. Really, it's been around in human existence. You think of like the book of Job, right? Sort of question, is it good to be here? Is it good to have been born? Or Ecclesiastes, all is vanity, right? The world throws this question at us. Or think of a later literary work, Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan Karamazov says, it's not God that I reject, but the world created by God that I reject, right? Now, he did in fact reject God. He was an atheist, but the point was it's more fundamentally the world. He wanted to hand back his ticket, as he put it. So Aristotle notes that there are many consequences of life that make men fling away life, such as disease, excessive pain, etc. So that it's clear if one were given the power of choice, not to be born at all would, at least as far as these reasons go, would be desirable. So we might say it'd be better never to have been. He also maintains that merely living for pleasure is not enough to make non-existence preferable to life. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that if life were just for the sake of amusement, then life would be absurd, that we go through all these sufferings and toils only to amuse ourselves. And so he's getting at a similar point here in the Eudemian Ethics. However, Aristotle appeals to the wisdom of Anaxagoras in order to address the challenge posed here. And he says, and so they tell us, Anaxagoras answered a man who was raising problems of this sort, asking why one should choose rather to be born than not to be, by saying, for the sake of contemplating the heavens and the whole order of the universe, right? So his answer here to the cosmodicy issue is, it's through contemplation that we find the world to be good, right? That we say it's good to have been born, right? And this is Aristotle's own view. Now, for Aristotle, contemplation was of the highest being, which he saw as God. God was understood as this unmoved mover, not quite the personal God of Judaism and Christianity or the great monotheistic religions, but rather it's sort of this principle of order in the universe, right? So it's a kind of contemplation of the whole order of the universe. And Aristotle says, one more quotation from Aristotle, which I think is, I love this quotation, happiness extends just as far as contemplation extends. And the more someone contemplates, the happier he is. Right? Seems like a pretty optimistic view, right? But this is against the backdrop of raising this question whether it's good to be here, right? But the point is, life is only worthwhile in appreciation, right? When we actually appreciate the value around us, right? And so that's the key point, is that life seems worthwhile when we're actually attentive to the things of value all around us, right? We see something similar in Aquinas. Aquinas thought that there was a kind of perfection of contemplation in the afterlife. He called this the beatific vision. But he allows for imperfect happiness in this life, which consists, first of all, in contemplation, but secondly, in practical wisdom. So what is this imperfect contemplation? We might call it a kind of earthly contemplation. So here's a quotation from Joseph Pieper. He writes, "The object of the beatific vision can be glimpsed, however imperfectly, by means of earthly contemplation. Because the world is a creation, a creature, God is present in it. Only the vision of something we love makes us happy, and thus is integral to the concept of contemplation, that it represents a vision kindled by the act of turning towards something in love and affirmation. How splendid water is, or a rose, or an apple, but as a rule we do not say such things without implying to some degree an affirmation which transcends the immediate object of our praise and the literal meaning of our words, an assent touching on the very foundation of the world. In the midst of our workaday cares, we raise our heads and unexpectedly gaze into a face turned towards us. In that instance, we see everything which is good, worthy of love, loved by God. Despite everything, there is peace and wholeness and depth, and splendor in the depths of things." So here again, we see this connection between contemplation and cosmodesy. Through contemplation, we come to see the world as a whole, in spite of the evil and suffering that exists, as good and worthwhile, worthy of love and affirmation. There's something like the sort of what Aquinas would call the convertibility of being and goodness. That there's an experience of the fundamental goodness of being. Okay, well, I want to started that. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip along a little bit here because I want to get to some discussion. So generally, this picture that we've gotten so far seems pretty religious or theistic, right? So it does raise this question. So just one point about the theistic worldview seems especially to be able to underwrite our hopes that the world is redeemable, where ultimate reality is personal rather than impersonal, and on the side of the good, right? There's a kind of, you might call it buoyancy of the good, or you think of Alfred Tennyson's line, "Love is creation's final law," although he thought sort of evolutionary picture with ravens shrieked against the creed that love is creation's final law. Is that nature red in tooth and claw with ravens shrieked against that creed, that love is creation's final law. It allows us to see being as a gift, right? So that's part of a theistic worldview. But I want to consider to what degree is it connected with a religious worldview. For Aristotle, he may not be, one of the monotheistic faiths, but he connects it with the contemplation of God. We see in these theistic traditions this connection with the beatific vision, even seeing earthly contemplation as seeing God in all things, so to speak, or as the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins put it, seeing the world as charged with the grandeur of God. So let me skip ahead here to this question of whether this picture of contemplation requires theism. So it is true that this grand vision has sort of this sort of ceasing, or the prominence of this grand vision of philosophy has also gone along with secularization, right? The fact that the contemplative ideal has been linked to a view of the world as a meaningful order is a main reason why many modern contemporary philosophers have dropped it, since many of them largely accept what has been called the disenchanted picture of the world. There's no overarching meaning or purpose. There's not some meaningful order that we can grasp, right? To return to G.K. Chesterton, he says, "Many people today are gay about the little things, but sad about the big ones," right? They find sort of projects that they find enjoyment in, but their overall picture of the world is rather bleak. So it's sort of like, Richard Dawkins, who says, "Universe is at bottom, blind, pitiless indifference," right? That sort of view is not altogether uncommon, right? And so we can understand why, this vision of contemplation might sort of go by the wayside, right? Okay, so there's some more things we can get into there, but just to give a few examples, I think of some non-theistic philosophers that are trying to recover this vision of contemplation. So first of all, one philosopher is Sabina Lovabon. She writes here, the only happy life is one that accepts the world as something offered to it as an object of contemplation, like a work of art, in that it is not for anything, but simply lies open to our disinterested attention. To experience the existence of the world, of anything at all, as a miracle, is to receive from it the happiness that an artist hopes to give in placing before us something beautiful. But the ability to receive this kind of happiness from simply being in the world is again a matter of attitude, of looking at the world as if it were a felicitous composition, in that sense with a happy eye, an eye ready to be made happy in the way cultivated or replicated by art. Ethics and aesthetics are one in respect of showing us that this is enough. Enough, for example, to make happiness possible despite the misery of the world, or to reveal the amenities of the world as dispensable as so many graces of fate. Okay, so talking about in spite of the misery of the world, she's clearly addressing the problem of cosmodicy, as I've talked about it, and sees again contemplation as a key part of that. Right? Okay, so this, I think, in many ways, a pretty attractive picture. It doesn't seem to require a theistic worldview, although there maybe are some phrases in there that may be striking for an atheist, maybe miracle in particular. And so just a few maybe concerns about this. We might wonder whether Lovabon is entitled to speak of the existence of the world as a miracle or gift, as she later puts it. This language seems at home in a theistic worldview, and so it seems she is speaking only metaphorically. But we do speak metaphorically, and it captures something, but it is a metaphor. It's not literally a gift or not literally a miracle, but it seems like that, right? Similarly, her idea of the work as being offered to us for contemplation like a work of art, as if it were a felicitous composition, can also raise the worry that she's offering artistic depiction of the world that does not in fact capture the way the world really is. So maybe it's just like, it's sort of like, maybe it's like putting lipstick on a pig or something like that, right? Maybe it's just sort of making the world sound nice, but there's all this evil and suffering, right? So is it completely a felicitous composition, right? Do we need some maybe deeper metaphysical reality to sort of affirm that could show it as fundamentally good? She does later speak what she says is the ineffable goodness of the world. But again, is that compatible with a view that there's sort of no rhyme or reason? We're just sort of, as I like to put it, what the cosmic cat coughed up on a certain kind of blind sort of evolutionary process that you get in Dawkins. So one might argue we need a teleological view of things, a sense that there's a purpose built into the nature of things. And Lovabon acknowledges that contemplation is traditionally connected with a teleological view of nature as a whole, but she also thinks we can do without this. There's a question of whether, in fact, that's the case. Right? So I want to turn to one other philosopher. I'll try to do this quick. Thomas Nagel is a non-theistic philosopher who's tried to recover a sense of teleology without God. It's a kind of Platonistic view that there's a built-in purpose in the nature of things. So Nagel raises what he calls the cosmic question, and he thinks that secular philosophers should try to provide something of the constellations that religion has traditionally sought to provide by answering this cosmic question of how can one bring into one's individual life a recognition of one's relationship to the universe as a whole. And I think Nagel might add further support to Lovabon by giving of this sort of contemplative picture, contemplative stance, by offering this sort of teleological picture. So Nagel is particularly impressed by the fact that the universe has given rise to life and conscious, intelligent beings capable of understanding the universe, and he thinks that this requires principles of the growth of order that are in their logical forms teleological rather than mechanistic. He offers a cosmic teleological view according to which each of our lives is part of the lengthy process of the universe gradually waking up and becoming aware of itself. It is specifically through our living out the contemplative life that the universe, as it were, becomes aware of itself, right? As Kurt Vonnegut put it, we're part of the mud of the universe that stood up and reflected, right? And the universe, as it were, comes to consciousness in human life as a whole, the sort of universe as a whole. Similarly, John Updike remarks, appealing to modern physicists who see the purposiveness in the universe and the fact that it's given rise to human life, so this is sort of fine-tuning stuff. He says, ancient religion and modern science agree we are here to give praise, or to slightly tip the expression, to pay attention, right? We're here to pay attention, to observe things, to appreciate them, right? And in this we can find a sense that the world is good. We can wonder at things in that more positive, euphoric sense. So I think there's a question here of, again, this isn't settling these questions, I'm kind of putting them before you. This is what philosophy does, engages with these grand traditional philosophical questions. The view of the contemplative life that I put forward seems to require some broader perspective of meaning, right? A sense of the world as having as a meaningful order, right? Is that still possible? We saw a lot of the sort of modern contemporary philosophers are skeptical of it, right? And they seek to escape from philosophy, but it seems in one sense philosophy is inescapable. Maybe philosophy is just what Sartre calls a useless passion, right? Maybe it does really make us miserable. Maybe it really does lead to philosophical melancholy and delirium, right? But we can really only know this, let me just get to my last slide, by taking up philosophy. So ultimately, whether philosophy can help us to live well depends on whether we can discover wisdom. Understood again as a holistic understanding that provides us with a meaningful life orientation towards the good. But the only way to find such wisdom is to philosophize. That is to engage in the examined life and practices of appreciative attention, right? So it's inescapable. It can help us to live well if there's wisdom to be found. And whether there's wisdom to be found is something for each of us to try to discover. All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David McPherson, for wonderful talk. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you have a question or want to ask to one of these, and I'll manage the queue, then throw them to our speaker. Yes, back here.
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say something about philosophical genre or practice of philosophy. So in the futurists, you get this sort of famous rejection of however right now philosophy is that it can kill it. Of course, a student goes and does exactly that.
Yeah.
But I think he's overstating that. But when you look at the contemporary academic journal article, you can kind of see where he's coming from. A lot of the authors that you drew on, they write in different genres and certainly not in the standard academic style.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could just say something about genre, writing philosophy.
Yeah, and I think this may be sort of question about sort of the academic practice of philosophy and whether it's conducive. So there's a genre that it cultivates. I think so. Currently in sort of United States and in English-speaking world, certain kinds of journal article with sort of tightly focused question, trying to make a small point or a small move within the broader philosophical literature is pretty standard, right? It's part of that analytic tradition where you're trying to break things down into component parts and to sort of isolate, some key distinction or key move that you're trying to make, right? I think that is an important part of philosophy, but I think the danger is it loses sort of the reason of being a philosophy, why that should matter, right? The average person, if they were to read a journal of, the journal News, like pick up the random journal and read it, how edifying would it be? Some of it might be edifying, some of it might not be. It was part of this traditional conception of philosophy coming from the ancient Greeks where, the philosophy was meant to be edifying in some way, meant to help you live well, right? And it's not clear that, the average journal article is trying to help you to live well other than maybe gaining some understanding on, some move within a literature, but unless you're already invested in sort of the academic enterprise of philosophy, why would you do that? So I think in terms of genre, I really do follow this idea of sort of, I'm less interested in kind of the common distinction between like analytic and continental. I think the more important distinction is like humanistic versus not humanistic. So this is sort of Bernard Williams' idea of philosophy as a humanistic discipline that's really continuous with other humanistic modes of inquiry, including literature. So I think oftentimes there's more insights to be found in, if your task is to seek wisdom, I think oftentimes you can find more wisdom in reading a novel, certain novels anyways, than sometimes in, again, the standard academic philosophy journal. Which again is not to knock, I think, academic philosophy journals. I read them. I think there's important, like if you're like committed to like, it's part of your career and you're like there's a certain level of analysis that's really important, right? But I think if we lose the context of like philosophy as a certain kind of reflective way of life that also involves appreciative attention, then I think we've lost the sort of reason of being, of like why it matters, right? And so I worry about the disconnect between sort of the academic enterprise of philosophy and the human enterprise of philosophy. And I'd like to see academic enterprise get more in touch with that. Now, whether that can get you tenure or not is maybe another question. So again, maybe this is, Alistair McIntyre makes this distinction between institutions and practices. Practices need institutions, so universities are institutions. They house practices, they house disciplines that practice certain modes of intellectual inquiry. But the point he makes is they can also corrupt that practice, right? They can enable it, but they can also corrupt it because of their focus maybe on certain goods of status and prestige and so forth. So I just think there is tension in terms of style. I think we should be broad-minded about style. I think whatever helps us to find wisdom. And I think we shouldn't be too imperialistic in academic philosophy about issues of style. But I do think writing is good. I make my students write, so it's true. Like spoken dialogue is there's a way in which writing should express dialogue, both that you've had with others, but also with yourself, right? In fact, this is something Pierre Daud says is like the most difficult dialogue is oftentimes a dialogue with yourself, the challenging of yourself, of your views, right? That can be unsettling. So I think written philosophy should, maybe there's a primacy of kind of the dialogical element, but I think the written philosophy can express that. I hope that helps answer your question, but it's a great question. Thanks.
That's great. Other questions? So I think Tony, you have a question?
Yeah.
The issue of spiritual alienation.
Yeah.
Alienation from others. Can you talk more about the difference between willed loneliness versus unwilled loneliness?
Yeah. So willed loneliness is, so I kind of have Aristotle's account of friendship in mind here, where he says the best kind of friendship is where you're united in the pursuit of the good together, right? But if we're not united in that, so Aristotle has remarks on how the person who's like vicious or lacking in virtue will have difficulty being a friend, right? So you can't be united with others if you don't share in the good together, right? So friends should help each other become virtuous. In fact, he thought the best friendships would philosophize together, right? Again, this is philosophize, the kind of wisdom-seeking endeavor, right? He thought that was sort of the pinnacle of friendship. So if you're not willing the good, or you're sort of divided against yourself, you can't be united with others. So Aristotle actually makes this point that he says, those who are kind of divided against themselves will be led into conflict with others, trying to compel them to do what's right when they don't want to do what's right. And so it leads to enmity and general lack of friendship. So that would be an example of willed loneliness. Unwilled loneliness is just coming into being as a self-conscious individual, right? Trying to find connection. I think loneliness, a lot of sort of spiritual writers have reflected on loneliness. So one person is Dorothy Day. Her spiritual autobiography is called The Long Loneliness. Loneliness is sort of this reaching out for connection, right? People talk today about there's an epidemic of loneliness, right? People feel disconnected. I think that's true. There's also, of course, something perennial about loneliness as well, that maybe it's an epidemic, but it's like there's a kind of loneliness that's endemic to the human condition. And loneliness involves, it's different than missing someone. When you miss someone, it's someone in particular. Loneliness is more of an open-ended reaching out for something that you think will bring you a kind of sense of fullness in that connection, right? And so you're maybe looking for a significant other or a close friend, or maybe it's ultimately like St. Augustine, our hearts are restless till they rest in God, or maybe it's some sense of cosmic oneness, or whatever the case may be. But that loneliness, I think, is not willed in the sense of that it's because you're not pursuing the good. You may be pursuing the good, but you're looking for connection, right? It's unwilled in the sense of it just, as it were, happens to you experientially. You're passive to it in that way, although it leads to activity of reaching out for some source of connection. So that's unwilled loneliness. It's not because you're like living unvirtuously. It's rather just part of being human that we have this unwilled loneliness. Does that make sense? Yeah, great. Thanks for the question.
I think we had a question over here.
Yeah.
Are there parallels between gratitude and appreciative attention? It kind of seems almost like if you set suffering aside in your presence, then you kind of see the connectedness connected to gratitude. Is that?
Yeah, I think gratitude is a mode of appreciative attention. So gratitude. So there's an interesting debate of whether what's called existential gratitude, which is like gratitude for your existence, whether that's, so this is sort of raising that issue of like, is contemplation connected with a religious worldview? Is existential gratitude, could you be grateful for existence if there's not someone to whom you're grateful? So gratitude seems to involve a 2-4 relationship. You're grateful to someone for something, right? Now you could be grateful to your parents. Like, so if you're grateful for existence, you could show, like it could be part of filial piety or something like that. But could it extend beyond that, to just that there's anything at all, right? This sort of gratitude for existence more broadly, right? Many people express gratitude, but maybe it's something just more, I mean, that may be, again, a kind of like Lovabond, that quotation. It may be a kind of metaphorical way of speaking that's trying to speak to an experience of, in our experience, we feel something's given to us. It's as it were, an unmerited good. We didn't achieve it. It's just there for us to appreciate, right? And I think that's part of contemplation. Sort of just appreciates the good things in your life, right? And so I think, I think gratitude is one way of expressing that, but it's a little bit more complicated in the sense of, I think there's this debate about whether you could be grateful for existence without there being someone to whom you could be grateful to. That's why, it's part of why I speak of appreciative attention, because it's sort of a broader term in that way. Yeah.
I think Chris, you had a question, and then we'll go to Martha.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for not annoying us as much as Socrates.
Good. You're not going to kill me? I can give you the cup of hemlock.
Is there a way in which appreciative attention can lead to alienation? You used George Manley Hopkins as an example. I'm not thinking of him since he leads to a vision of the grandeur of God, but other poets, maybe Emily Dickinson, Elizabeth Bishop, who have incredible appreciative attention, but may very well lead to their loneliness, to their isolation from others, because they see things that others don't. Right? I wonder if there's a way in which that attention can lead to alienation.
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is where like I am kind of sympathetic with Hume, like be a philosopher, be still a human being. Like you want to, or like as an artist, you want your art to put you in touch with humanity rather than like lead you out of it, right? And so there may be a more normative notion of like the proper way. If the goal is to live well, right, we would want a mode of appreciative attention that wouldn't be alienating, right? Although, it is, sometimes these artistic geniuses or, intellectual geniuses, I'm a little hesitant with the language. I know there are people like really smart and everything, but they also go to the bathroom like the rest of us, I don't want to elevate people too much. And I think that's part of the problem is like you could feel like, oh, I'm so different from other people, right? I think it's part of what I sort of recoil from in like Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. I'm like, well, everyone examines life to some degree, right? It's like, he sort of presupposes like all his fellow Athenians are just like thoughtless pursuers of money. And maybe that's true to a certain extent. Maybe they're not caring for their soul enough, but they're also human beings who like have questions and are reflecting on things. And so I think some of it may just require, some humility, like that as we engage in our intellectual, artistic pursuits, like that maybe we're special and not so special at the same time, like everyone's special in some way, and like to see that common humanity in the process. I mean, there are instances of like Paul Gauguin, like abandoning his family to go, paint naked women in Tahiti, and he's a great artist, but like, did that like help him fulfill his humanity in a deeper way? Or do we need a more integrated life where the true, the good, and the beautiful all come together? So I think it's more of a challenge. I mean, it's a good challenge, but it's a challenge for like, how do we do it in a way that humanizes rather than dehumanize? How do we do it in a way that helps us to be more at home in the world and less alienated from it, or less alienated from others, more connected with others. And I think art can do that. I think philosophy can do that. So it's a challenge rather than, so I think it's a good challenge. Do you have thoughts on that, of how you would pursue art, or,
I think that's beautifully put. I think you're exactly right. We don't need to use Keats' language of genius.
Yeah.
We've got away with Keats.
Yeah.
And I do think even Emily Dickinson, her poetry will humanize us.
Yeah.
In spite of her own experience.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd add to that, I take it the point of like an artist is not to be like, oh, I see things so differently, but it's like, it's more like, here, let me help you see what I see, right, and help you to appreciate it, right? When you paint a beautiful, like say, take Van Gogh or something, painting some beautiful natural scenery and like transfiguring in a way. This is not Van Gogh. This is Alfred Sisley, but another impressionist painter it is a kind of appreciative attention to say there's a kind of coming together to see the world and appreciate the world together. That's another way you might think of in friendship. We want people to like see and appreciate things in a similar way. So I think ideally an artist would. I actually have very bleak views of modern art. Like putting a toilet before us. I don't know that that's edifying in any way. And like, here, come and see this toilet. I don't. It is kind of like the artist is set apart or critiquing. It's not. I don't know. It's sort of dehumanizing to me. It's like.
I do like indoor plumbing.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But as far as like, are we helping to see the world, appreciate the world, and help other people to do that? It's a great question. I love that question.
That's great. Mark, I think you had a question?
Yeah, we were talking about appreciation of existence.
Yeah.
Here, I think it's clearly a fact that many people will just have a deep appreciation of existence, but it seems to me, one of the thing about this is that if you ask them why, you might get some answers. And some of my opinion is that those answers would lead to some conception of beauty. And if you take Lovabond, her use of miracle as a metaphor, my sense of things is that she's incomplete and hasn't pushed it far enough. So those who may have an appreciation of existence in and of itself and don't take it any further, they may be missing a lot.
Yeah.
And a Lovabond may say, well, you can't answer those questions. You can't go any further.
Yeah, maybe it's just a mystery. Yeah. But it appears to us as given in some way in our experience. And
right. So given then it seems to be that other questions are in the back.
Yeah, again, given is a... Yeah.
Like, why does anything exist?
Yeah. You could say it's at least a quasi-religious sensibility to be like grateful for religion. That's like grateful for existence as such. That a sense of like the sort of wonder that that any of us should be here at all. That there's something rather than nothing, as you're saying. Chesterton called this the abyss of light. That there's like that by some strange mercy that we should exist. Right. The probability that any of us exist, if you just think about like what has to go into any of us existing, is like something. It's wonder-inducing at some important level. Not everyone like buys into this. Increasingly, the position of what's called antinatalism is becoming very prominent. Antinatalism is just the being against having children. There's a philosopher, David Benatar, who wrote a very cheery book called Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, which has gained a lot of popularity. He shares Sophocles' judgment, or like at least what's expressed by Sophocles in one of his Oedipus works, that better never to have been is as you see in the title, takes from Sophocles. So that is a view, right? And the question is, like, philosophy can be seen as an attempt, at least the traditional practice of philosophy can be seen as an attempt to resist that view, right? To find wisdom, to find that life is worth living, right? We see that in the Aristotle passage. He says, we're here to contemplate the order of the universe and the heavens. So those are kind of what you might call existential options, to go back to that Pierre Hadot language before us, right? Is it good to be here? Is it good to have been born? I take it to be that's like one of the most fundamental human questions that all of us face. None of us chooses to be born, but all of us are tasked with trying to address the question of whether it's good to be here, right? Now, I personally hope we can come to a positive answer to that, but I don't think it's guaranteed in advance, as it were. And so philosophy is this hopeful enterprise to try to find that maybe that it is good to be here. What Lovabond calls the ineffable goodness of existence, right? But that's not something you just get to through, again, I want to emphasize, not just something you get to through rational argumentation, right? It requires appreciative attention to things that are valuable or things worth loving, right? So that's sort of the spiritual exercise. That's one of the aspects of what Pierre Hadot calls the spiritual exercise of philosophy. It requires appreciation, to find things worth appreciating, right? To find goodness, that it's good to be here, you have to find things worth loving, right? And so in an important sense, we're here to praise or to pay attention, as John Updike puts it, right?
Yes, good. So we're almost out of time, but I want to give time for one question from one of our students. AJ
Happy to
Shin.
talk further after.
Of course, but AJ, please.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could play a little bit of devil's
Yeah, absolutely.
real quick. When it comes to, I guess, more extreme views with philosophical quietism, or denouncing the value of philosophy, I'm a little curious as to how someone would have epistemic access to that in the first place, given that,
Access to their perspective.
Yeah, to the fact
So it's
that
kind of like what?
philosophy is useless, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So say it is the case, for the sake of the argument, that philosophy can't whatsoever help us live well. That would be something that's good to know. That would be something that would help us live well, so that we don't waste our time going to lectures or
You would know this was a waste of time. What hour and a half of your time you can't get back. Sorry about that, everyone.
But to be able to know that in the first place, it seems like you have to be falling back on some kind of value theorizing and kinds on purpose and the good. How is it that you could come to that place in that kind of the first place? How could you even do that without resorting to philosophy and its value in the
Yeah, I think that's part of the point, that we all live some answers to these grand philosophical questions, even if it's a negative answer, right? We live some answer to the question, and then it's sort of like, okay, can you give reasons for that, right? Like why I think it's better to never to have been, right? And David Benatar will give you reasons why he thinks it's better never to have been. He gives this asymmetry argument where, pleasures lost are not, like not to be counted. It's to be discounted, whereas like the harms, if you like don't come into existence, we can count that as a kind of benefit. So this is like the benefit of like non-existence, right? So he gives an argument. I don't find it particularly persuasive, but he's philosophizing. He's philosophizing a very negative, pessimistic conclusion, but he's engaging in a kind of philosophy, maybe not a particularly edifying one, other than maybe, kind of disillusionment. I mean, it's sort of like Schopenhauer. I mean, he's very, Benatar is very influenced by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, he loved this idea from Ecclesiastes of the vanity of existence, influenced by Buddhism, and basically was trying to help liberate people from the illusion of caring about existence, right? Just the goal was a kind of ceasing to care. That was liberation, was ceasing to care. He didn't recommend suicide because that was too much caring, right? And so if you've ever seen Fight Club, it's a very Schopenhauerian movie. It's a sort of ceasing to care, right, is the goal, right? But it is a kind of therapeutic mode of philosophizing, even if it's a sort of deeply pessimistic one. So I think you're right. We live some answer. You can just live it. But this goes back again to that Chesterton point. We can either live by thought that's been thought out or thought that hasn't been thought out. And we may as well at least think it out if we want to have some degree of confidence in the answers we live by. So that's why, again, I think it's inescapable. Even if it leads some people like Hume to philosophical melancholy and delirium, he gives arguments. He's written this book and tells you why he's, based on his empiricism and so forth, why he thinks certain kinds of metaphysical questions are beyond our grasp and so forth. So there's arguments there. It's just, towards a more skeptical conclusion and a more modified view of philosophy in Hume's case. Yeah. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
No, these are terrific questions. So just before we wrap up, and thank you, Professor McPherson, just a couple of announcements before we wrap up. So for undergraduate and graduate students, so if you're new to us here, check us out. So by scanning this QR code over here with the student updates, you can hear our latest news on reading groups, lectures like this. We'll pick up or continuation of as James was talking about, our reading group on love and war in literature, as well as questions of the philosophy of mind, the relation between the mind and the brain next week. If you're not an undergrad or a graduate student, check us out over here where you can scan this QR code for community updates. Roughly about once a month, we'll have some kind of gathering. We call them salons over at the HI House. So we'll continue the conversation as we do with the student. And finally, we also have a short survey that says pulpit, or it should really say survey, for tonight's event. So I encourage folks to scan the QR code now before you forget. The survey takes you like 30 seconds. So just let us know your thoughts, what you thought about the event, any suggestions you might have, or anything. We'd love to hear from you. So I'd encourage people to take a second to fill that out. And also as well, as many of you know, we're an independently funded 501c3. So even though we serve Rice University, we're totally independently funded. So we function entirely from donations and grants. So we are very happy to take donations. So you can also scan the QR code for that now as people are wrapping up and their survey. Just a couple of thank yous. So first off, huge thanks to Professor McPherson for a wonderful talk.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
And thank you for really going the extra mile to be here. I realized it was a challenge. Also, thank you to Houston Institute Board of Directors. We couldn't do this without you. Special thanks to Mark Dolworth, our board chair, for helping to make this possible. Huge thanks to my assistant director, James Prather, partner in crime, helping to make this possible. Also, thank you to all of our student volunteers. Jack Miller, I see you over here. He was the guy holding the sign by the parking lot. So you can thank Jack for that. AJ Shin, Gabriel Allen, Jared Duran, and Greg Checkler. And finally, thank you all for making this event a great success. And we hope to see you at the next one. Please hope you continue the conversation at the reception outside, and hope to see you there. Thank you very much.